The other great thing about Access was in the governor's office, you could just go talk to Bob and keep your eye open just to who was going in and out of seeing the governor, because it was all right open, it was right there.
I feel bad, we've been talking about 10, 15 minutes and the name Tom Green hasn't come up yet.
Okay, I'll bring up the name Tom Green. That was, I think, one of the high points, particularly in the 1970s, was the rise of the broadcasters. You had Tom Green for Channel 2, you had Bob Pizer for Channel 4, you had Jim Harrington for Channel 7. We got Lou Gordon in and out of here. We had, of course,
Harry Boyes.
Walt and Paul Weisenfeld were terrific on the radio. Artie Wainwright was around. Lee Foley, my ex-husband. Just really excellent reporters, broadcasters who probably would have been sniffed at, I guess, by a lot of the print folks, but they were the guys to beat. I remember the night that my office called me and said, Pizer's reporting that Martha Griffiths is going to be Blanchard's running mate, and it was like, oh man, that was the prize that everybody had been trying to get for weeks. Those guys were tough. They were really good competitors, and I think that we're all, none of us is well served by the fact that virtually everybody except Schoolbick is pulled out in terms of the TV stations in Detroit now. If it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead.
Tom Green, in 1982, Tom Green had worked for TV2 in Detroit, and he was the Lansing correspondent. He got hired by Channel 4, and I got a call out of the blue from Channel 2 and said, would you be interested in being a reporter? I said, I've never worked television in my life. They said, no problem, we'll train you, which never happened. But at any rate, the first day on the job at TV2 was the day there was a city strike going on in the city of Detroit, and the Republican National Convention was opening that day at Cobo Hall. This was the convention that nominated Ronald Reagan. So I was living on the east side of Detroit, and I was trying to figure, God, is anyone ever going to know who I am? How am I going to go up against a legend? So I get in a cab, and I'm heading down Jefferson, going downtown. The cab driver says, what are you going down there for? I says, I'm a reporter. And he said, oh, do you know Tom Green?
Who is as competitive as they get. All the broadcast guys, we had this one room for a long time that we all shared, and it was basically Tom's office, and the rest of us got to use it because he allowed us to. It's now, I think the clerk's in there now or something. It's right behind the House of Representatives.
Clerk, I think.
And he was really competitive. He had been replaced at WJR by Harry Boyes, who in turn moved on. I'm not sure where Harry went. And then a guy named Jim Dygert came in, who had a print background, excellent reporter. He was getting stuff all the time. And Tom didn't like getting beat, especially by a guy who had his old job. So one day Dygert's got some hot story he's just fed, and he's being very secretive about it. He's getting ready to leave. He takes his tape recorder, locks it in a file cabinet next to his desk, which is right across from Tom's, leaves. As soon as he's gone, Tom pulls out his keychain, unlocks the file cabinet because he's got a key for it because he's the one who brought it in the first place, and had the story on the air within an hour. He didn't like getting beat. He was as competitive as they get, but Tom had to be tough because broadcasters were like women in the early days of that. No, they were ostracized.
Like no woman.
They were ostracized. Let me finish the thought before we go to commercial. They were ostracized. They were the bastard childs of journalism, and the women were not welcomed in by the old crew in the beginning. You had to fight a battle, but Tom had to really fight a battle because he was constantly in the beginnings, when he was the only broadcast reporter in there, he was constantly being sabotaged because they saw him then as a threat. Now it's harder to ostracize the whole internet, but that's basically the threat now. But that's what Tom was then, and he really had to fight the fight for everybody in terms of access, in terms of being able to televise session, to be able to get a camera in there, to get a microphone in there, to get on the floor, to get the access. And he was like a bull in a china shop most of the time, but he got the results. And the smart politicians figured that out, like this one here, who knew the value of television. And that, I think, was one of the things that really changed how the whole Capitol got covered. All of a sudden, it wasn't the 600, 800, 1,200 word stories that became as important as that 15 seconds on the tube.
And we forgot to mention, too, we were talking about great broadcast journalism. Tim Jones from JR went on to the Free Press, and also Matt McLogan from Grand Rapids TV.
Actually, Tim Jones would have been with us tonight. He writes for the Chicago Tribune, and his assignment was previously covering the Midwest, and he was going to angle his way into Lansing. But because the Tribune's had several cutbacks, he now covers the United States, and he said he'd really like to be here, and he would have been a nice addition.
And of course, the press corps had its characters just like the legislature did. Was it urban legend or was it really true that Tom dressed up like a Lansing police officer and stole the budget?
No, I would tell you that story, but I'm not sure the statute of limitations has run out. He had a car that looked like an unmarked police car, and he put a light in the back of it so it looked like an unmarked car. So they had the little twirly light in the back, and he went out there and he acted the part without saying he was. And then just to verify that he was legit, he had the person who was in charge of the printing office call back to the governor's office to get verification, and somehow I answered the phone. To this day, I don't think Milliken's forgiven me. I'm not sure. I don't think you were there yet. I think it was Weeks that was really pissed off. But yeah, that was the time when getting the advance copy was a very big deal.
Yeah.
Very big deal.
Didn't he boast that day that he was going to get it?
Yeah, and he did. And that was the one. I think there was a tax increase in that one.
And the print folks had their characters too. You may remember Gary Schuster, who at one point walked a white rat on a leash through the Senate chambers.
He also impersonated a congressman on Capitol Hill. It was Bob Traxler. Bob Traxler was in the hospital at the time. And my then boss, Bill Ford, said to me, "What do you know about this Schuster?" Well, we used to call him Shyster. That's all I needed to say. He said, "Tip O'Neill's really furious." Because I think it's some federal offense to impersonate a congressman. But, you know, Bob Traxler was probably forgiving. Bob?
You got to rat somebody out now.
I never impersonated anybody. Yeah, the names that, I mean, we could sit up here all night talking about these names. Tim was I will never forget Tim.
Which Tim?
Tim Jones, because he was the one who gleefully came in one night, came running in the door and said, "You'll never guess what Coleman Young just called your boss."
This is being recorded, Bob.
Well, it was a two-word phrase with the letters M and F in it, and then I had to turn around and go in and tell the governor what had happened, because he was going to get hit by the reporters as soon as he left the office, because then there wasn't any controlled access like they have now. And I went in, and the governor was sitting behind his desk, and I said, "I thought I should let you know that Coleman Young, in the heat of the moment, just referred to you in a fairly common street term." And the governor's eyes narrowed a little bit. He said, "What did he say?" And so I told him, and he stood up and he held his glasses in his hand and he started biting the corner of his lip, which was something he did if he was really mad. And he said, "He shouldn't have said that." And the next morning, some of you have heard this story, the mayor called him up and explained that's a word that can have different meanings depending on how it's said. And it can be a term of endearment. And a number of years later, when I was working for the mayor, we were actually working on his book, and that story came up. And I said, did I ever tell you that I was the one that had to tell Milliken about what had happened? And he said, "What did he say?" And I told him, and he roared, and he said, "That's Bill Milliken."
It wasn't the first time that he did that to him either. One of the things I learned from Tom Green was how to listen to meetings on the other side of walls. And they were having some sort of, back when the legislative leaders and the governor still talked to each other, and strangely enough, they're having a quadrant meeting in Bill Ryan's office, the speaker. I think he was speaker at that point. I'm not sure. Yeah, he was speaker. And all five of them are in there. And I remember Milliken coming out and being a little red-faced because I'd heard then Senate Democratic leader Coleman Young use the same adjective, noun, whatever it is, in describing the governor. And he came out, and I think from that point forward, he was kind of used to it. He never liked it, but he got used to it. But it was amazing to watch them work together. Years later, by last year working for Crim, Michigan was facing a budget situation very similar to what we have now. We were broke. We had nothing. And I don't remember the details now, other than I had somehow, some way, had weaseled my way into the quadrant meetings where they were working on the budget. And what was amazing then that I think we really miss now was watching these five people and the staff working for them, including Jerry Miller, the budget director. Weeks was a part of the conversation, and the four legislative leaders. And they really put all the BS beside, off the table, And they got right down to it. We got a huge mess here. What are we going to do about it? One. Two, it was assumed they're all going to take responsibility for the ultimate resolution. It was none of these one Republican vote makes it bipartisan deals like we have now. It was everybody's going to vote proportionally on what they decided, but they were bound and determined they were going to figure it out. They were going to fix it. And when they left that room, if they had a deal, they had a deal, and they could all produce on it. And it was just a completely different mindset. As it turned out, they agreed that we were going to cook the books. Which they agreed was the best short-term solution. This is when did Milliken retire? 70. It was the last year for Krim, Vanderlaan, and Milliken. They were all lame ducks at that point. But they just decided this is what we're going to do. They had to have some tax legislation as well. But they decided we're going to fix this problem. We're not going to leave this state totally screwed up. We're going to do the best we can to solve it on a bipartisan fashion. They trusted each other. They could work together. They respected each other. And even though they disagreed on the solutions, when they came out of that room and had an agreement, it was an agreement. And that's something that is just so woefully missing from the system now, not because they're people with bad will necessarily or they're stupid or anything. They just don't trust each other because they don't know each other.
Larry, you're a particular expert on taxes. Would you talk about your fondness for George Montgomery?
Oh.
Speaking of characters.
I was called it going to tax school. You'd go to George's committee meeting. He was a Detroit Democrat, longtime chair of the it was just taxation committee back then. Yeah, they didn't call it tax policy. They weren't afraid to call it taxation. And every meeting he would just wax on tax, the history of a tax, where it was headed, what was behind it. Things that legislators now, again, they just don't know. George knew every nuance about taxes and the impact if they changed something, what that was going to do. And he would mix that in, of course, while he was chain-smoking cigarettes with his love of ponies and his never consummated deal to get in off-track betting in the state. Something he tried forever to get.
I think we need to talk about Dominic Jacobetti. So, do any of you have any special recollections?
Well, Joanna was talking about when we did the Movable Feast series. Wasn't that what we called it? The Movable Feast. This was the nightlife in Lansing, and we went to the Playboy Club one night. And
Had to do that.
and one of the lawmakers we had dancing with a bunny, it turned out, was not his wife. When she saw the picture on the front page of the news, and that caused some problems. But one of the parties we went to was a Jacobetti fundraiser. So I said, is it all right if I come to this? Yeah, sure, come on over to it. So he had, at the door, it was sort of a raffle, and they were going to raffle away this great big, beautiful, what do you call it, cellophane wrapped in a basket, and there's cheeses and bottles of booze, and it's a really, it's really fancy. So he's doing this, so Jacobetti, he rigs the thing, and he ends up, and he pulls out the number, and it's my number. And and I said, Jake, I can't take that. Oh, God damn it. No, I really can't. I really can't take that. So he finally agrees, and I said that would really be ethically not proper. He finally agrees, and he gave me a little UP belt buckle, which I still have. But, that was Jake. Jake was the kind of guy, you walked into his office, and he, honest to God, would sit there, and he was called the Godfather. He was around for 40 years, and he was the unquestioned person in charge of appropriations. Behind him was Marlon Brando peering down in The Godfather role. And he would sit there, and he would roll up little pieces. When you go, why do you treat me with such disrespect? He relished it. He was just the absolute character. And then when he got caught up in the House Fiscal Agency scandal, when he was never charged with anything he should have overseen the people who were running the fiscal agency and did not. So he was derelict in his duty, but no one ever accused him of anything criminal. So here was a man that was revered. When he'd get up on the floor to speak, and he could sit there, and whenever he spoke, Jake came from the mines, he knew how to talk. The whole house would hush. I remember one, it was a seatbelt debate, and he was going on, and he was opposed to it, and he finally ended, and people go, Jake, yeah, and he finally ended. If you're born to drown, you won't hang. Okay. But at any rate, Jacobetti, after he'd been the star of the show for so long, after the fiscal agency, where he was removed from the chair of the Appropriations Committee and Dick Young took over, It was rather sad to watch those last days when Jake would sit there by himself on the floor and no one came around. Like he was the pariah. He was, this guy who had enjoyed such power, and all of a sudden he was an outcast.
And if you want to get a view of his effectiveness, go visit the campus up in northern Michigan.
Or the Veterans Hospital.
The highway.
He basically paved the UP.
Well, should we talk about various speakers we have known? Some of us just love to talk about Speaker Ryan, because that was the first one we knew. But I think it'd behoove us to address some of the speakers and some tales. Air Sorg over there, you might want to.
I always used to love getting calls from reporters asking me about Krim resigning as speaker, which happened fairly regularly in caucus. We were banned. All staff was banned from the caucus initially. We finally, after he resigned for the third time as speaker, finally talked him into at least letting me in there so I'd know he'd resigned. But it was amazing to watch him and Mr. Ryan work together. Because they understood every legislator and what motivated them and how far they could go with them and what things they could push them to vote for and what things they couldn't push them to vote for. But they were so good at getting consensus. They're total non-ideologues. And I think the same was true of the Republican leadership at the time. They were more focused on results. And it reminds me of the old great line from Everett Dirksen. I don't remember the exact quote, but he was the senior senator from Illinois when I was a kid. And he used to say, I'm a man of principle, and my first principle is compromise. And he wouldn't get, their goal was always to get a bipartisan vote, to get everything through, to reach a consensus rather than to make a political point, to get things done. And they were very practical about it, but they also understood exactly what it took to motivate this group of 110 type A personalities to get a consensus so they could get things through. They knew when to throw their weight around. They knew when not to throw their weight around. And it was a fascinating team to watch them work together. Krim learning from Ryan as his chief of staff, and then as his, I guess he was floor leader for one term before he became speaker. And then to watch Krim try to pass it down to Gary Owen. But by that time, things had changed so much. It had gotten so much more politicized. Plus, I think the personalities probably started. It all started really when that group of people left, and now the leadership's John Engler in the Senate, Gary Owen in the House, and Jim Blanchard as governor. And you have three people who really liked the political fight as opposed to the policy fight. Ryan was all about policy and getting things done on policy, and I think Krim was the same way. And he was the man, after all, who was responsible for the shortest press release in the history of the Capitol. They had promised the press corps they'd give him an answer on whether or not he's going to run for governor. And we just put it out one day for immediate release off of the speaker, contact, blah, blah, blah. No. And that was the end of the press release. I even spelled it right and got it out there. But he was more interested in the policy than he was the personal advancement. And I think that's something that I really miss now. That you see these political fights and you see all these party line votes back and forth, and it's so much more about ideology than getting results. Everett Dirksen would be shunned now for saying something like compromise. It's a dirty word on a lot of talk radio. Not mine, but on most.
I said you had an enlightened show.
Well, Krim was actually, when I came to Lansing, he was a staff person. He was chief of staff to Bill Ryan. And the reapportionment plan that was adopted in '71, I guess it was, actually carved a seat out for Bobby so that he could run for the legislature with the idea that he would be majority leader for a term and then be speaker. And that's the way it turned out.
Was it what?
Yeah, one term as majority leader.
Yeah, he'd been there once before, right?
Yeah, then he lost.
And the one thing about Bill Ryan, that characteristic that I didn't see in any other speaker, where he would commit to something long-term, whether it was doing something on mass transit in Detroit or whatever. He would take on the most complicated, the most unwinnable situations, and his attitude was, and he embodied that in his approach, you never lose if you never quit. And that was Bill Ryan.
I think that there's probably a reason why we refer to him as Mr. Ryan as opposed to Bobby or Gary or somebody else. He had enormous respect that really cut across both sides, I think, of the aisle.
And he was operating usually at a power disadvantage with a Republican governor and a Republican Senate. And he would just outweight everybody, just talk. He was just famous. Just keep talking. And you ask him what time it is, he'd tell you how the Swiss makes a watch. So.
One time he got into an interview situation with some hostile reporter at a TV station, And he said, okay, you're going to be that way? He gave one-word answers to all the questions. The reporter wasn't good enough. He kept asking him yes and no questions, expecting to get a monologue in return, and he'd get yeses and nos. And he just watched the reporter sweat for about 5 minutes asking these questions, and he finally took pity on him and gave, I think it was a half-hour show, I think the last 25 minutes was one answer. But that was Ryan. He had a puckish sense of humor, and even the people that despised him politically were completely opposite him on the issues. I think they absolutely adored him. And it's tough to find folks like that anywhere.
Well, we're soon going to be into the era of reapportionment. Do any of you have some nice old reapportionment stories?
Well, one of the best stories I ever had was the reapportionment plan in 1971, because there were two plans that had been submitted to the Supreme Court. There was a Republican plan and a Democratic plan. And we knew that there was a majority Democratic court, and we knew that was going to be the plan that was adopted. So I went over and talked to Jim McNeely, who was the state Democratic chair at the time, and I said, just tell me off the record, I'm not going to quote you, tell me what your plan is. And he told me, we did this and we did that, and there was, I think, Art Law, who was a really right-wing Democrat from Pontiac,